Hi, everybody, again. I'm glad to see a few of you in person, and I know that there are many of you who listen at other times as well. We are at our halfway point through our study in the book of Ruth. So I think that it's coming up to a climax soon, and it'll become more and more interesting as we go. And I have heard occasionally from people, but please, if you have questions or comments, send them. So, because that does guide our study and what we do. And this week, we're talking in more detail, part 5 in your notes, the return to Bethlehem. And remember that the Hebrew word for Bethlehem meant house of bread. And I think that's very symbolic in this whole study of Naomi's return to the house of bread and Ruth coming to the house of bread. So we begin chapter 2 this time. We've spent quite a bit of time on chapter 1. This little book is only 4 chapters long, and the pace picks up from here on out. So we begin in chapter 2. Ruth finds favor and is able to harvest food in the field. Now, the way this worked in those days, there was a provision for the poor to be able to go behind the reapers who got the long sheaves of the grain and would always drop some pieces on the ground that might otherwise go to waste. And the poor were allowed to harvest those pieces that dropped. So it is at this point that Ruth meets Boaz, who ultimately becomes her husband. So we will see what happens when Ruth goes to the fields. We're continuing to follow the format in the JPS commentary outline for this study, because I think the way they broke it up into segments made sense to me and were digestible bites that we can really chew on and have a little time with each one. So now Ruth and Naomi are in Bethlehem and settling in. And we see that the women who spoke to Naomi when they first arrived are not around anymore. The 2 women are left on their own. They're fending for themselves. They're at home and they're starting life all over again with nothing. Now, Naomi mentioned that she had a rich relative, but no one had come forward to offer any help to them. And Boaz was related to Naomi's deceased husband. But I gather from all I can find out, it was not like a brother, it was a more distant relative. So in other words, in some respects, he did not have the duty that a brother might have in a situation like this. And we notice that Ruth first asked Naomi's permission to go glean in the fields, to glean up the remains from the leftover crop gathering. So they collect the grain that falls to the wayside. Maybe Ruth did not want Naomi to glean, and there could be several reasons for that. Maybe out of respect, she was older. She was previously probably fairly well-to-do. And in that culture, she might have felt shame because of her change of circumstances. And we don't know for sure how Ruth found her way to Boaz's fields. He wasn't the only rich man in town who grew the grain. And people asked, was this only chance? And we stated this before in this session, whether one believes in chance. And you will find throughout Scripture at times where people do deliberately rely on chance. They'll literally throw the dice and let that be the decision maker. But this is one of those cases where what happened might be assumed to be chance, but others might interpret that as divine intervention. And the book of Ruth allows for the possibility of seeing it just as chance, but a little twist to it, that the recipient of blessing has to be responsive to the moment of opportunity. You don't just sit there and do nothing and wait for the dice to fall your way. It's not a passive kind of thing. The recipient of the blessing is responsive to that moment of opportunity. And we see that Naomi, when she thought about what happens by chance, she tended to attribute both good things and bad things to God. She felt she was a victim of hardship and loss, and losing her husband and her sons, and nobody in the immediate family that had any obligation for her. From what I read, rabbinic tradition suggests that Boaz may have been her husband's cousin and Naomi's nephew. So there was a connection, but not immediate family. So Boaz notices Ruth in the fields, and he already was aware of the fact that she was taking care of Naomi. So perhaps as a result of his extended family connection, he made it easier for Ruth to glean in his own fields. And there seemed to be nobody else stepping up to help them. And Ruth went to the fields to glean because they had to eat. And the extensive laws and rules developed to take care of people like this were intended to make it possible for the hungry poor to survive. But there was some risk in gleaning. There would be unattached men and unattached women working out there, and there was some risk of assault. I don't know if risk of robbery or some form of abuse. We don't know for sure. But in any rate, Jewish writers and the JPS commentary seem to infer that it was possible that Naomi had less concern about Ruth's well-being than Ruth had for Naomi. And Robert Alter notices, he says that Naomi seems to step back in a sense. And we could speculate. Maybe she was anxious and willing to take a risk with Ruth going to the fields instead of herself, because Ruth was younger and probably stronger. And maybe Naomi felt conflicted about bringing a Moabite into her home and into the community. She could have been ashamed of being dependent on Ruth. Probably in that era, it would be perfectly normal to be dependent on a man, but would it be normal to be dependent on another woman? It's not really clear. And she also could have been very overwhelmed by her own bitterness and feelings of loss to give much attention to Ruth. And at that time, we know that according to the Torah in Deuteronomy, Moabites were excluded from the Israelite community. So both Ruth and Naomi took a risk of being excluded by returning from Moab together. It was not a nice, clean welcome home, Naomi, nor was it, hey, this new girl here, new girl in town, let's all welcome her into the fold. No, they kind of had to earn their way in, and Ruth definitely earned her way in. And we know that Naomi did not seem to tell Ruth at first that there were extended relatives that could possibly have helped them. Things began to change only after Ruth goes into the fields to go to work. Now we have several terms that are used in this chapter 2 that are worth mentioning. Boaz is called a man of substance. And if you look at the Hebrew text of the term that's used and the culture, we think he was an older man, and he's called by this term Gibor Hayil. It was similarly used in other places in the Hebrew Bible, like for the chieftain Gideon in Judges, or with David before he became king. It can mean a hero or a warrior or a person who is higher economically or socially. It's somebody in very good standing, in other words. And in the Targum, where these scriptures are discussed by the Jewish rabbis, in Aramaic, his name means strong in the Torah. And so he has some sort of depth of character that goes beyond his power or his wealth. It's not the only meaning that he was just a rich man. So, and we know that one of the 2 pillars in the temple great hall was named Boaz. So the implication may be that he was kind of a pillar of the community. So Boaz sees this young woman, Ruth, who is working herself very hard. His own servants say to Boaz, she hasn't sat down once, she's just working her buns off. So he realizes that she's committed, and he makes provisions for her to glean more easily. And he says that he will protect her, and he tells his servants to leave a little extra along the way when she's gleaning to make it a little easier for her. So the term Boaz uses to greet his field hands, the Lord be with you. And they respond in the same way. And those words are still part of the priestly blessing used in synagogues today. Christians use the phrase as well. And it was an accepted way of blessing or greeting someone in that era. And then they use the term Ruth, a woman of valor. And it's the same words that are used in Proverbs of the good and faithful wife who is praised for her industry and caring for her family and helping earn what the family needs, was not a passive little wife sitting there with everything handed to her. No, the woman in Proverbs, is a very busy, industrious person. So it's the same term used there. And at that point, though, Ruth is still being referred to as the Moabite. She hasn't really completely earned her way into the community yet, but she is being described as the good wife, the good woman in Proverbs. Boaz uses that same terminology, and we use that very famous Proverbs passage even today to speak of good women. When my mother died a few years ago and I presided at her burial, I used that passage to describe her in our closing service at the graveside. And it's used often to describe an industrious individual who takes care of other people. So here we have Ruth, a woman of valor. And then in this chapter, it says, as luck would have it, but this was divine providence coming to allow the good to occur. Boaz, noticing her, already knows something about her, and he asks, whose girl is that? Now, we might today think he's wanting to know, is she hooked up with anybody in that way? No, in that era, the question was to establish identity. Who is her father, or who is her brother, or who is she connected to in some way? And that same language was used when Abraham's servant asked Rebekah at the well whose daughter she was, or Saul asked who David was. It wasn't just applied to women. It's a way of asking who they belong to or what household they're in. And although we can infer kind of a love story here, as though our friend Renato in Spain has pointed out, it probably was not that kind of thing. But it's not suggested that Boaz was attracted to her as a potential spouse. He was attracted to her manner and her trying to take care of Naomi and her hard work. That's what gained his respect of her. His own servant said, she works all the time and never rests. So he put her in a position to get first pickings. And he told her to stay close to his girls and follow them. And he refers to her as my daughter, as Naomi had done. So maybe this implies both Boaz and Naomi both were older and had higher social status than Ruth did. But it's also kind of a term of, I'm going to protect you and I'm concerned about you. So then Boaz says, I have ordered. He's ordered his own girls and his own young men not to harass her in any way, to protect her, and to give her first pickings. And he goes so far as to tell her, when you are thirsty, go to the jars and drink. Now, this is a very symbolic thing in biblical texts, to go to the jars and drink, to be offered a drink or to be allowed to drink. There are other biblical narratives that take place at a well. A man may be traveling looking for a wife. Moses and Jethro's daughter, Rachel and Jacob. And JPS commentary notes that there's a contrast between Ruth being offered water by an Israelite man. And this is after this long tradition of enmity and angst between the two groups, who definitely were not friends. And it's important to remember that one of the problems that had occurred with the Moabites was due to the time that Israel refused the Israelites water. So being offered water, an Israelite man offering a Moabite woman, is kind of a reversal of that whole problem that had started the tradition of the hatred between these two groups. Here the Israelites were trying to escape from Egypt, and they needed water, and the Moabites wouldn't give it to them. Now an Israelite man offers a Moabite woman water. And we also are reminded of Jesus asking the Samaritan woman at the well for a drink. And that was another situation where there was no love lost between Samaria and Judea. So it is a common motif that occurs a number of times in the Hebrew Bible, and Jesus picks it up again and uses the imagery and uses the situation in the New Testament. So it's interesting, all these women were going about their daily work when they were chosen as wives. They weren't sitting somewhere passively and looking pretty like they just stepped off the cover of Cosmopolitan. No, they were busy. And I've often said to young people who say, where can I find a good man or a good woman? And I would say to them, well, you're not going to find them in the local bar, probably not going to be a good starting place. And people say, well, you're not going to find them at church either. It'd be the happy hunting ground for young men, perhaps, but it certainly isn't the happy hunting ground for most young women, since women in the church who are really active and committed tend to outnumber the men. So, but if they're busy about something important, I would say to people, you meet them in a hiking club, or you meet them in some activity that you both enjoy, and you've got a common ground that offers you the beginning of a foundation. So in this case, it's kind of a symbolic reparation between their groups, with the Israelite Boaz offering water to a Moabite woman and offering grain or ease of collection of grain in order to make it possible for them to survive. So it really was a symbolic of the coming together of these two groups. Israelites who were victimized now reach out to those who previously denied them what they needed for survival. And so I think there's a lesson here for us. Do we wait for the other to make amends when a group has been separated, or do we make the first overture? So we might want to think about that, how that applies. In today's world, if you look for that good potential spouse, it's going to be a tough thing for a lot of people. And we look at the characters of Boaz and Ruth, a potential spouse. we need to look closely at their character. So if you're advising someone, or you yourself are looking for someone, you can't look in the usual places, and perhaps looking in itself, if you're busy doing something and it happens, and then you are surprised. I like to say, I wasn't looking. I definitely was not looking. I tried to get rid of Yeti in a number of ways. I wasn't looking and she wasn't looking, but it worked out. And that was the best for me, at least. So Naomi had mixed feelings toward Ruth, but Ruth made a covenant and a commitment to take care of her. So in our own lives, we can think of situations where we might have had mixed feelings, or the other party might have had mixed feelings, but there was definitely a bond of some sort, a friendship or a deeper commitment. And we have to learn to deal with our ambivalence in the middle of that commitment. It's not always how you feel, it's the commitment you made. And it's worth thinking about what happens and what helps you when you have mixed feelings. It's very useful in any committed relationship of any level. Things get kind of messed up. You feel ambivalent. What am I doing here? Why am I giving so much in this situation? You know, is this really a good deal or not? And the issue is to deal with the fact that you have that bond, you have that commitment, and then to deal with those mixed feelings, or to set them aside for the time being and just do what you gotta do. And we've sometimes been very fortunate to be in a situation where we ourselves are in an unfamiliar or unknown situation or place, and for some reason somebody reached out and helped us. Think about how that felt at the time. What did we learn when someone unexpectedly offered hesed to us? And have we ever had the opportunity to serve someone else who was a stranger or in an unfamiliar situation? It's not always easy to offer that. And for some people, it's not easy to accept that offer. Yesterday, we were on the highway and we stopped at a rest stop in the mountains. And there was a young couple that had been at that rest stop all night because they couldn't get their car to start. Well, it took us a couple of hours to try to resolve the whole situation because there was no phone contact in that area, no cell phone coverage. So we went back and forth 3 times trying to get a tow truck for them. So I'm sure they didn't expect that. They were asked us to cable jump them. We did, and that didn't work. And I think they were a little bit afraid in the situation to ask people for help. They were young African Americans and probably not going to ask anybody for a ride. Our car was full, we couldn't offer them a ride, but we did go back and forth. And so we have no idea what that would mean to offer that help. And I think when we are helped, we also often have no idea what is coming to us or why it's coming to us. And to deal with the response, just to be grateful and to offer someone else hesed. So that is where we see in the book of Ruth, Boaz comes to the center stage as one who's going to help these two women, his relative Ruth, who's in the background at this point, and the young Moabite Ruth, who has come forward and is taking the bull by the horns and working herself very hard to try to take care of them. So we see the characters of both Ruth and Boaz as they come forward. So this is where we are in our story. The pace will pick up from here on out, and we will post the readings and the text next week for you to go on into the next readings. And please send us your comments or questions, because that helps guide what we do in this study. We want to make it useful, interesting, if not entertaining, because it is kind of a very interesting story from long ago, which we might ask, does this have any relevance to today? And I think the principles are very much the same. So I'll stop with that. Are there any questions at this point?
I have one more. Do you think Naomi might have sent Ruth to that particular farm or whatever, since it was a relative? Did she sort of like direct her sort of that way? It doesn't say that, but could she have mentioned him and everything?
By happenstance, but I don't think we know how she happened to end up in Boaz's field. There's no given information that Naomi had directed her at this point. She does direct her later on, as you will see. She becomes much more involved. But at this point, she seems to be not the active participant. Ruth says, I'm going to go glean, and goes out. So that's all we know at this point. It's an interesting speculation. But they act like in the story that, well, we see that Boaz knows something about Ruth. We don't know how much Ruth knew about Boaz at that point, except that he had a field where she could glean. We don't know how much Naomi had said about the relationship. The Jewish interpreters seem to imply he waited to tell Ruth that she actually had relatives there. So at any rate, it's all food for thought.
But they, Martha,
Yeah?
they are Bethlehem in Galilee, right?
No, they're not. They're near one another. They're not the same. I'm a little vague on the geography. I'd have to look it up, but I will before next time. But they're not. Bethlehem is in Judea, and I think Galilee is also in Judea. I think, but I will have to check my geography.
Okay. I've learned that there's like two regions, like one Galilee and one in Judea, with cities of the same name.
I think I will get a little clarification on that, and maybe I can send out a map that would show this relationship before next week. It's a good question, and I'm kind of vague on it, to be truthful.
Well, thank you.
Okay. Well, let's have a prayer before we stop. Lord, we sing your praises without ceasing. You rule over all things with wonderful order. You temper the cares and burdens of our toil. And by giving us rest and healthy recreation, you refresh our weary bodies and minds. We entreat your kindness that this place will contribute to our activities in the good that renew the spirit and strengthen mind and body. Grant all we meet here the enrichment of companionship, and together we offer you the praise that is your due. Thin Bible pages again. May God, who brings light to our minds and strength to our bodies, guide us in all we do, so that each day we will find gladness and friendship. God bless you, keep you, and thank you for joining us. And as we said last week, if you were able to donate to St. Matthew ECC Church at their website, saint-matthew.org/donate, you'll find ways to donate. Last week, we noted we had a donation from one of our friends in Belgium. So they're aware of who we are, and they've followed us for years, actually, just as we have followed them. And we appreciate those offerings to our continuing ministry. So God bless you, good night, and I'll see you next week, Monday at 7 o'clock. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Goodbye. Thank you, Martha. Thank you, Yeti.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Good night.
Bye.
Bye all.
Bye, bye, Tammy, and thank you.
You're welcome, guys. Love
Bye,
you.
Bye, John. Bye,
All right.
Bye.
Bye.
Rebecca.
Did you see my message?
But oh,
I just sent you another one.
okay, I'll check it out.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Martha, I like that cool breeze.
John.
Well, bye, honey.
Bye, John.
I saw you had the door open. It felt nice.
Oh,